So when you look at a temporary context, you're basically arguing the value of a text to modern society, and you're basically dictating how it is relevant. Now, of course, if you're looking at Shakespeare, the common groan I get from most students is, oh, it's not relevant because it was written 400 years ago. Yes and no. Yes, it was written 400 years ago, and yes, probably Shakespeare wasn't really considering that 400 years after his death, people would still be talking about his work. However, the thing about it is that there are still a lot of ideas, and the quality of language is still such that it still has value today. And the ideas, and particularly the fact that a lot of Shakespeare's work was developed from history, a lot of the ideas that have existed in his time were over 2,000 years old and still haven't really changed that much from that time where he lived to now. So discussing and evaluating a text to modern society involves taking in all those factors and really understanding what it is that those texts do, and really basing your own interpretation and basing your own ideas on those sorts of arguments. Now, by comparing and contrasting themes and ideas to social and current paradigms, or basically trends that are happening now, you're deciphering basically how a text retains value and if that value does remain consistent. So in my earlier example, when I mentioned the rights of women, that's something that has changed quite a lot, and as I said, for the better. So by deciphering how a text retains value, if a text has a narrow-minded view towards women's rights, then obviously that's something that has changed over time, and that the value of that text is probably lessened quite significantly, particularly if when half the students in the class read it and go, oh my god, this is horrible, then, and even boys in the class will be going, oh my god, this is horrible, then it doesn't really retain its value. Now, you need to look for themes and ideas which sort of do have a little bit of universal quality or are persistent. So ones that can retain their value over time. So ones which are consistent, which can stay. Now, you may say, well, yes, themes and ideas in the story are not necessarily universal or consistent or persistent. But the one thing about it is you're trying to find ones that are as much as possible, because they are ones which do have a lot more that you can talk about, but also the ones that are far more easily recognized in your responses. So while it's not necessarily true that each text can be interpreted the same way by everyone, by finding ones which are persistent and which do carry on through time, you're able to compose your argument a lot easier and you don't have to explain it as much. So that's a simple thing. So if you come up with a completely obscure point, one that doesn't really make a lot of sense, or if you're trying to discuss a point which was valid 100 years ago but it's not really valid now, it's not something that you can really include in your response unless you're talking about that particular time period. Alright, you may also be asked to draw links between texts. Now, text and context involves comparing texts to each other as well. So by basically comparing a work to its counterparts, works that are similar, works that have links to others, you're basically looking at things from you could look at how a similar story is written at a different period, a different place, by a different person. So, for instance, if you're looking at how a horror movie or how a horror text has been composed now as opposed to maybe 50 years ago, there's a big trend difference. So if you're looking at sort of older horror movies, there's a lot more emphasis on suspense and drama, whereas modern horror movies are dependent more on violence, gore, and trying to shock the audience. So there is quite a different way of looking at a text just purely on the time period and the place where they are composed, and particularly the qualities of whether the writer comes from an affluent life or a developing country or wherever it may be from, or basically what kind of person is who is writing it. If they have very outspoken views, if they are quite conservative, if they are just trying to tell a story. All these things have qualities, and particularly when you're comparing one author to another, you sort of have to look at those things as well. Alright, now when you're responding to questions relating to context, basically you're attempting to say how the meaning of a text is shaped by the combination of the text and its context. So in other words, how you look at it, how it is basically, how you get that interpretation, how you get that meaning from the text and the world around it. So by looking at those two things together, what you are doing is you're basically interpreting that relationship between you reading the text and the world around you. So it's asking you to sort of open up your horizons and be quite open-minded a bit. And really just requires you to look at things from a more universal perspective. All right, now you might look at things like, for instance, how a text is relevant to modern society, which we sort of looked at already. How a text is shaped by the time it was composed, so the sorts of things that were happening at the particular time when it was written. How ideas reflect the human experience, so it might be how people survive war, how people survive poverty, how people survive oppression, all those things are quite powerful storytelling methods and do relate a lot to their context. And a relationship between texts of different eras. So as I mentioned before with the horror movie example, how you can compare a horror movie from the 1950s to probably one from now. So all those things are quite different, and particularly when you're answering the question, those sorts of things do come across as being as significant when you're putting in the response together. You may also look at the relationships of text between different authors. So how one author who might be outspoken is different from one who is from a different culture or from a different way of life. So those sorts of things can change as well. You may look at relationships of text between different mediums. So a basic relationship between a film and a book. So let's have a look at that last one, because this one has a bit of an interesting connotation as well.